Gannon, and this is Mad About Miniatures. Today, we're talking to miniaturist Chris Toledo. He recently created a spectacular miniature art gallery for the National Museum of Toys and Miniatures. Chris is known for his miniature tile work, which is breathtaking in its realism and beauty. You are going to be surprised when you find out what it's made from. Chris is on Instagram at I Build Small Things, and you can find me on Instagram at Mad About Miniatures. Let's go talk to Chris. Hello, Chris. It's so great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me, Becky. It's great to be here.
It's great to talk to you. We met for the first time last summer at Guild School, which was really fun, and talked about miniatures quite a bit at the Bilge, which is the sort of after-hours place people get together at Guild School to have a beer and talk about miniatures and other things.
Yes, one of my favorite parts of Guild School.
It is, isn't it? I mean, there's so many favorite parts, but that is definitely one of them because that's really your chance to just talk to people who will listen forever to you talk about miniatures, unlike most people in real life.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, especially with Guild School, you know what I mean? You're kind of always on the run. You're always going from class to class. I think that aside from the bills, the only other opportunity you get is the meals, and that's always great, but you're still kind of like, moving from class to class after the meals and stuff. So I feel like the bilge was kind of like the best way to like connect with other miniaturists and just talk to people and like, just get to like know everyone.
I love miniature school, and part of what I love is that it is busy and you get so much done. There's so much to do. You have classes during the day, there's things at night, there's seminars. I went kayaking one night.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I always call it miniature summer camp because that's literally what it feels like. You know what I mean? You're literally like working on miniatures, talking about miniatures. You're just submerged into this like miniature world, and that's like probably one of my favorite aspects. Anytime anybody asks like to describe miniature or Guild School, I'm always saying it's like miniature summer camp.
That's what my kids call it. They're like, "Are you going to mini camp again, Mom?" Because I always sent them to camps. They're like, "We're glad you can go to camp now too, Mom."
I know this is adult summer camp. Oh, and then also, one of my favorite things about Guild School is, the amount of tools that they provide for you. It's so amazing to like get to learn all these different tools that, I wouldn't normally use in my own studio.
I like that too. I do. This year I'm taking like wood turning.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh. That's literally like one of the things that I learned at Guild School is using a lathe, and I loved it. Like that is probably one of my favorite things. I still have yet to really get a good. Like I have one that's kind of it's a little flimsy. It wasn't really like a good as good as the ones that they provide for you at Guild School, but it's definitely turned me on to making things with the lathe.
That's cool. Well, one thing I remember we talked about is you really loved miniatures as a little boy, right? A pretty young age.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, at this point, we're going on almost maybe over 30 years at this point of being in the miniature world. I'm about to be 40 very soon, and so yeah. So I think right around 9 or 10 is when I first got into miniatures.
How did you get into them?
It kind of happened by accident. I think it was in a dentist office or a doctor's office. It was one of the two. They had a copy of Nutshell News on the table, and I'd never seen anything like that because at that point in my life, like any miniatures or doll houses, my perception of that was the plastic pink Malibu Barbie dream house. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
That's like what my perception of miniatures was. And then I came across this magazine that had all these amazing tutorials and a lot of work by these incredible artists like Pat and Noel Thomas. I'd never seen anything like that before. And I was completely fascinated, because at this point, like my father, he was a woodworker. He did a lot of construction. We already had like a huge woodworking shop in our garage. So I was already familiar with woodworking. And so to see this level of detail at this scale, like I'd never seen it before. And I was like instantly hooked. Like I literally stole that magazine from the doctor's office, and I was like, I am getting into this. Like, this is so cool. And even my dad, like once I showed them, all this stuff, they were like, wow, like this is amazing. It's like the same processes that you would use in like normal construction, but it's scaled down with like smaller tools and smaller material, but it's like the same idea, you know what I mean? So it's like you're able to kind of create these worlds and immerse yourself in these projects, but without the scale of like a full size structure.
Wow. All I can think of, Chris, is Every doctor and dentist office I've ever been to doesn't have a miniature magazine. They just have highlights for the kids. And what would have happened if you'd never seen it?
I know, right? Like, what would I be doing right now if I had never come across that magazine? It's wild how something like that can kind of, just one little instant like that can kind of change the trajectory of your life forever.
Well, and it's amazing to me that you didn't just look at that magazine and say it was cool, but you took it with you and it really did change your life. Like it really hooked onto something that you didn't let go of.
Yeah, yeah. And if I remember specifically, like the magazine itself was featuring this project by Pat Noel Thomas. It was this home that they recreated. It was the Green and Greenhouses, also called the Gamble House, which is actually the actual house is here in California in Pasadena. My dad had shown me that house, like because he used to do a lot of work in that area. We always used to drive by, and it's this incredible example of like mixture of like prairie and arts and crafts architecture. And so it's a museum now, and it's an incredible piece of history. And so the magazine had that home in miniature featured. So I think that's what also kind of instantly attracted me to it, was I was like, oh my God, I know this house. I've just never imagined seeing it in miniature in like such incredible detail and scale.
Now, Nutshell magazines, that later became
Dollhouse Miniatures.
Dollhouse Miniatures. Okay,
Yeah.
just so everyone knows. Well, that's fantastic. So it is interesting that what you said about that house and being in California, because I think a lot of your work is inspired by the architectural details in California, particularly kind of early, what would you say, early 20th century or
Yeah, yeah, definitely early 20th century. So anything from like the early 1920s to like the late 1930s, that's probably my ideal era of architecture, especially here in Los Angeles, because, that was like the old Hollywood period. And, there was a lot of new money coming into Los Angeles and, all these like actors and directors and producers. There was a lot of European travel at the time, and they wanted to recreate that style of architecture that they were seeing in Europe and homes here. So that's where you get a lot of like the revival architecture. So you have a lot of Tudor revival, a lot of Spanish revival, a lot of Italian Renaissance revival. And so it's just like these incredible examples of architecture that were coming up all over Los Angeles. And being born and raised Los Angeles, like I've always been around that, and I've always been so inspired by it, especially when I started getting into miniatures. You know what I mean? I felt very, very new to that world, especially wanting to like make it a business. It was like, okay, there's very niche artists in this world that each have their own kind of thing. And coming into it as a newcomer, I was like, I don't want to step on any toes. There's like the specific artists that work on the French Baroque style. And I was like, where do I fit in? And then I was like looking into like my own personal taste. And I was like, you know what? I love this period of architecture. Like I've always loved it. I've always been fascinated by it. And I don't see any of the representation of that in miniatures. So I was like, oh, I think that's my niche. Like that's how I can find my place in this miniature world, by, recreating the things that are personal to me.
Oh, that's so interesting. My son lives in LA, so I've been there quite a few times. And we also spent this past January in a beach town about 45 minutes from LA. And one thing I'll say about California is, at least compared to all the other places I've lived, is there is just such a variety of architecture.
Oh yeah.
Every day, like I'd walk by these beach homes and like you said, there'd be a craftsman, then there'd be a Tudor, then there'd be the lone Cape Cod. But then you're sort of what I call Hollywood hacienda style, which I call it that because I'm not sure it's like legitimate Spanish architecture. It's sort of the Hollywood version.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. It just goes back to what I was saying about how like these people back in the 20s, they were, European travel was so hot at that time. And so these people with money, they're like, I'm rich, so I want to create my own little version of Europe here and with my own time and money.
And create they did some really fabulous houses. You've made some houses, but a lot of what you're known for is room boxes, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So how many houses you've made? It started with your big Spanish house.
Yeah, Casa, California. So yeah, that one is basically like a mix of like every piece of Spanish architecture that I've ever fell in love with. So, anytime that I see something within the Spanish style that I love, I'll always kind of write it down or make a note of that little piece of detail in the architecture. And so Casa California was kind of like my love letter to not only like the Spanish style, but to California, because it was kind of a combination of all my favorite styles of Spanish architecture with, with a little bit of Mediterranean revival, with a little bit of Italian revival, but still with like a very heavy Spanish influence. But yeah, so that's probably like the biggest piece that I've ever done. But if we're going all the way back to when I was 9 or 10, I've done about 5 houses total. The first ones were all kind of kits that I kind of like started with to like just become familiar with the scale and just kind of playing around with like how can I tweak this to like make it my own. As I got, older and and further into the hobby, I really wanted to kind of start creating my own designs because, a lot of these like dollhouse kits, they're geared towards like playthings. And so they're not always to scale. Certain rooms aren't always the size that would, a typical room would be. And so that's what kind of started getting me into like, okay, maybe I should start kind of designing my own things and kind of creating my own designs that are a little bit more to scale and a little bit more practical.
When you started, there must have been a lack of more modern houses, or certainly there couldn't have been a lot of Spanish or Mediterranean houses, right? I mean, it was more cottages, Victorian.
Oh yeah, exactly. And that's actually what really inspired me to make Casa California is that up to that point, I had literally never seen any kind of Spanish influence in the miniature world. Everything was very Victorian or cottagey, which I love. I absolutely love Victorian. And, we have a lot of that type of architecture here in Los Angeles as well. But I felt like there wasn't any of the type of architecture that I really love seeing, which is particularly Spanish.
I love that style too. It's funny, when we were at this beach town, we walked by and my husband and I would point to the houses we love. And he'd always point to the lone Cape Cod, which I thought looked out of place. And I'd always point to these big, these big ones with the beautiful tiled roof and the courtyards. And that Casa California you built, like that would be my perfect house if I could live anywhere.
Same here, 100%.
The courtyard and the fountain.
Oh, yes. Yeah, no, literally. Like I said, that's literally my dream house.
Now, one thing I thought was really interesting is you really, even now, don't see a lot of miniatures in that style.
Oh, yeah, no, that's the thing. Over the years, I started to see a little bit more, but they're usually from artists from Spain or they're foreign countries, basically. You don't see a lot of American artists recreating like the Spanish style. And so I feel like Spanish style in the United States is very signature to California. Like I see it all over the country, but I feel like the biggest influences are here in California. All that can be kind of traced back to the San Diego World's Fair that happened basically about 100 years ago at this point. And that was when some of the like strongest influences of Spanish architecture were put on display. Since California has a very Mediterranean style climate and we have like the historical missions that are all down the coast, I feel like that kind of played into that. And that's where like Spanish style became kind of like the signature style for California.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that the fair did that.
Yeah, it's crazy. And like what's cool about it too is like most of the buildings from that fair are still there. It's a great place to like go down and like look at this, incredible examples of architecture, like the Spanish Churrigueresque style, which is a very like Baroque style of Spanish architecture, which has very exaggerated and very heavy like architectural elements. It's beautiful. I mean, if you ever have time to go down to San Diego to check out, it's in Balboa Park. There's some incredible buildings there.
I will do that. I'll make time for that. One thing I loved about your house, how did you recreate those Spanish tiles on the top? Because I would think that that would be a little problematic, a little tricky.
Yes, and it still is because just so you know, that house is still not finished after, let's see, I started in 2016, so we're going to almost 10 years now working on that house. I would say it's about 90% done, and
Okay.
it is specifically because of those roof tiles. So yeah, I mean that was a whole process in itself because you can't get miniature roof tiles anywhere in the miniature world unless you're making them yourself. Like I tried to source them everywhere and I couldn't find them. And so I ended up just kind of creating my own method. And the way that I did it is, so I got it's just like a material, like a polystyrene sheet, which is like like a plastic composite,
Okay.
basically. And then I cut out basically like the roof tiles have like a very like a slender trapezoid shape, and so I cut out about 5,000 of those.
Oh
Um,
my. Oh, and just not to interrupt, but just so our listeners are clear, I'm talking about those kind of, what would you call it? Rust. They originally were clay curved tiles.
yeah, like the barrel roof tiles, basically, is
Yes.
what they're called. Yeah, so it's very typical for Spanish. You will never see a Spanish style house that does not have that on it. And so that was my dilemma.
Yeah. So they used to be made with tile, and I understand now they're not always made with that anymore.
Yeah, nowadays they make them with like concrete or more composite materials that are lighter weight. Back in the day, when these tiles were first started made, they actually used to make them on, like the workers would make them on their thighs. So they would literally cut a sheet of clay into like that shape and they would put it over their thigh to get that curve. And that's why they also have like a little bit of a taper. And
Mm.
that's how they shaped them. Yeah, it's wild. And so I kind of basically took that same idea. I cut out these pieces out of polystyrene and kind of used the same method. Not my knee, obviously, because my knee is a little big to make them at that size. But I used a dowel, and what I would do is I put a row of these little flat sheets across the dowel, and then I would hit it with a heat gun, which would cause them to melt a little bit, and then they would take the curve of the dowel, and then I would pick them all off and then start again. And so basically that process just went on and on and on. Once I had enough of those, I made a mixture of like terracotta colored paints and I used real clay and made a little bit like a slurry. And what I would do is I would dip each tile individually in the slurry and then set it and let it dry. And each one needed about 3 coats to get it fully coated. So that's why it never got finished, because imagine having to do that process 5,000 times. And with the Spanish roof tile, there's also 2 layers. So you have one layer that's underneath that's, inverted. And then the top layer that you see visually sits on top of that. And that's how you kind of create that linked, interlocked look. That's that's where we are.
So you really need 10,000? Is that what you're telling me, Chris?
Basically, like I haven't done the actual numbers, like full count yet, but after doing about 5,000, it basically just got me the first layer.
Oh my.
And that's basically all that's left. That and a little bit of landscaping, because there's a couple little patches around the house that I wanted to add just a little like touch of green. But yeah, that's pretty much all that's left to do in the house. But it's just such a tedious process that it's always been kind of like, okay, I'll get to it later. I'll get to it later. It's almost done.
If you ask me what real and miniature houses have in common, it's that a miniature house often isn't completely done, or if it is done, we continue to redo it, just like we do our real house.
Oh my gosh, yeah, absolutely. And I will say that there actually has been times in the last, 6, 7 years that I've been working on that house that I have done some remodeling. You know what I mean? So like,
Exactly.
especially because as an artist, I'm always trying to kind of expand my techniques and expand on what I know how to do. And so, because I've been working on that house for so long, a lot of the pieces that I made for it 7 years ago aren't up to par with like what I would like now. And it's even just like remodeling a home. Like, it's about 2 years ago, I literally ripped out all the bathroom fixtures in both the bathrooms of the house and like redid all the bathrooms. You know what I mean? So it's literally just like remodeling an actual house.
Exactly. So when you said it's 90% done, I wanted to say, well, what miniature house really isn't not just 90% done?
So I feel like, especially with miniature projects, it's like it's never really done. You know what I mean? It's just whenever I kind of decide to like, throw in the towel, which, is definitely not anytime soon for sure.
So one thing that really strikes me about all your work is you love tile, Chris. You love tile with a fierce love.
Yes, I love tile.
You love tile like other people love their dog or their children. I mean,
Yes, 100%. I mean, that kind of became inadvertently my specialty in the miniature world.
so tell me about your love of tile and when you first started making mini tile.
I mean, it really started when I was working on the Spanish house, to be honest,
Yeah,
because I feel like Spanish architecture, there's so much tile that goes into it.
there is.
That's kind of what led me to discover a lot of the techniques that I use today, is just like trying to figure out how to fill those gaps, that things that I couldn't find in the miniature world. So getting into, doing bathrooms and kitchens and things that would have tile, I was not finding the type of materials that I would want. I'm such a sucker for realism, and I love trying to get things as close to like the real look as possible. And one thing that I wasn't finding is tile that kind of achieved that look. there's some amazing artists that do some incredible miniature tile work. I mean, they do some amazing hand painting work. Like I've seen this one artist, I can't remember their name right now, but they do like Delft type tile, like the
Oh,
Dutch Delft
nice.
tile, like with the blue,
Hmm.
and it's insane, like the amount of detail and how beautiful that looks. But I was looking for just like good old fashioned subway tile, when I was doing some of my pieces, because that's such a typical tile that was used in like in 1920s and 30s kitchens and bathrooms. And so I was like, that kind of set me into like, okay, I need to figure out how to do this because I did source some like real actual ceramic tiles by some artists that were the real material, but even still, like I feel like just it's like marble, if you're using the real thing in miniature, the scale is just it's a little out of scale. Even like something that's glazed with real ceramic, it's the way that the glaze will harden and set, like it still looks like just a small full scale tile, basically. So my kind of mission was like, okay, I need to figure out how to make these tiles that look real and then read as real, but in miniature. And so that just sent me down a rabbit hole of like trying different processes. I was hand cutting individual tiles and then glazing them with like different resins. And that's one of the things that I would use in my early work of how to do tile. And then, as time progressed, I kind of figured out more different techniques. Techniques that I kind of figured out kind of just opened up this whole world of like different, how to do different tile patterns. And then it became a challenge. So every room that I do that I end having tile, I'm like, oh, like how can I push the limit? Like how much more detail can I add to this tile? And that kind of just became like my thing, I guess.
It did. It did. And beautiful, some beautiful tile work.
Oh, thank
What
you.
do you use right now?
Yeah, so I just do a composite now. So it usually depends on like what type of tile. So if I'm doing like a terracotta type style or like a ceramic type tile, I'll use different materials, but it'll usually be either plexiglass or MDF. And so what I'll do now is I'll laser cut my tiles. I mean, just because that just makes it easier, especially when you're needing to cut 400 or 500, if not more, pieces of
Yeah.
tile. I honestly just figured out like hand painting was probably the best method to get the look of tile that I wanted. Using different colors to give this tile like a little bit of a wash and then giving it like 4 or 5 coats of spray paint, like a clear gloss to create that, not only the gloss look, but when you put that many coats on, it kind of gives each tile a little bit of like a bevel.
Yes.
There's just a little bit of depth.
Mm-hmm.
I either lay them down individually or I'll do them in sheets and then attach the sheets and then I just use spackle paste. You can get at your local hardware store to patch holes in the wall, and I use that for grout. On top of that, I'll do a little bit of aging and make it a little dirty, because like that's one thing that I also love to do. I'm not a huge fan of like pristine, super perfect, clean miniatures. I like something to look a little old and a little used. Like I feel like that's what kind of gives a little bit of a soul.
There was one bathroom that you brought to Chicago. It had white tiles, this kind of white curved sink, and the kind of octagonal white and black flower floor. And that was my
Yeah.
bathroom growing up.
Oh, I love that. I feel like that's one of my favorite things to hear. And I feel like I got that so much at Chicago this year. It's like so many people were like looking at these rooms and they're like, oh my God, that's the bathroom that I had growing up. Moments like that, it's like, okay, like this is why I love to do this. You know what I mean? To like, I'm a huge nostalgia person, and to actually be able to like fire up that nostalgia at other people makes me just really love this hobby even more.
I think more than any other miniature I've seen, I saw the bathroom and I literally like had a flashback to like, as a teenager, we lived in this older house trying to get ready and put all my curling iron and my blow dryer on that little pedestal sink.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it really just took me back to like a moment in time.
Oh, I love that.
Is the sink custom made?
Yeah, yeah. So I make all my own fixtures, and that's something that I kind of started working on over the years too, as I got more and more into the hobby. I think it mainly started as like me being cheap, and I'm just like, okay, I need to, because as many listeners know, like this hobby can get very pricey sometimes,
It
and
can.
and as an artist, I was like, okay, I need to figure out how to cut out as many outsourcing things as possible. So I still
Yeah.
outsource a lot of my lighting. There's so many incredible artists that do such insane lighting, and I was like, I don't matter how much I can try to make my own lighting, I will never add up to like how some of these artists, like they're magicians in my eyes, you know what I mean? But there's certain things like the fixtures and the appliances that I was like, I want to figure out how to make this, because I mean, even just like the tile, when it came to like bathroom fixtures, you just weren't seeing a lot of like very like scale detailed pieces. A lot of the miniature bathroom fixtures that you see available are, like they're the real ceramic, but they look a little clunky. They're not perfectly to scale. And
there's maybe 2 or 3 toilets to pick from, 2 or 3 sinks.
yeah, exactly. And that's literally what kind of got me started on this. Same with the tile. It's just like, okay, I'm not seeing this representation in the miniature world. So it's like, okay, how do I fill this void with my own work? And that's, kind of where I started developing the different types of sinks and toilets and just different bathroom fixtures that I just wasn't being able to find. It kind of just started with one project and just trying to like, okay, recreate a certain style. And then once, I learned a little bit about how to make that piece, it kind of got me open to like, okay, now I want to try this style. And it's like each piece is kind of has its own processes. Most of the pieces that I use now, they're all cast from originals that I made. The originals were just like a mixture of MDF that I would like laser cut into the shape and then like stack them. Other pieces have like hand carving. Other pieces have bases that like sink bases that I made on a lathe. So like each basically style has its own like process. And then once I kind of finished that style, I just, made a mold of it, cast it, and so I can recreate it for future pieces.
Well, you really nailed them. I mean, your tile, it looks so real. Just the sheen, depth, the grout. I mean, it's like you were in that bathroom and just recreated it, which I guess is what you did.
I know. I mean, if you literally open up my phone and look at my album on my phone, it's literally just all pictures of vintage bathrooms that I'll like come across on Facebook, on Instagram, anywhere online. Anytime I see a bathroom that I'm like, oh, this is cute, like a vintage bathroom, I'll literally save it. It's just bathrooms and kitchens, basically.
Just tile,
Just
tile.
tile, literally, just tile patterns, tile colors, just anything from the 20s or 30s is like, yeah, I'm a sucker for it.
Yeah, and that sink, I mean, it had the same finish as the sink I grew up with. I mean, you really got every little detail right. That's how real it looked.
And I try to share with others. It's like, the type of materials that I use and with the type of processes that I use to kind of create those actual looks, because a lot of people they see, these pieces and they're like, oh my God, I would love to make tile like that, but I don't have like a kiln or anything. And I'm like, oh, like I don't have a kiln either. So it's like just telling them like, it's literally just acrylic paint watered down to get that kind of like washy ceramic glaze look and then just spray paint, really.
It's interesting because I was telling my husband this the other day as I was making this art kit. Sometimes the real thing doesn't look as real in miniature as something else,
Oh yeah, exactly. That's what I always say. You know what I mean? Like it's not about the processes, it's about the end result. So I'm like, some people are very diehard about using actual material. So if they're doing anything with marble, they like to source like real marble. And, it's the same concept. You know what I mean? Like the veining and the coloring of marble does not translate down to miniature very well, unless it's like a very heavily detailed type marble. So I like to paint it. I feel like recreating those finishes in miniature is kind of the best way to get that realist look. I mean, even with wood, when I'm making things out of wood, like I'm very particular about the type of wood that I like to source. Like any piece of wood that I use in a project, I have to visually inspect it fully to make sure that the graining is right, that it doesn't have graining that's too heavy, that's going to just scream, this is a full size piece of wood cut down to miniature. So like even adding like tiny things like painting little wood knots or like adding just a little bit of wood grain with a paintbrush to bring down that scale. I think that's kind of like the best way to recreate those scales and kind of fool the eye into thinking that this is a full size room and not a miniature.
Absolutely, and you really do. And now, a quick word from our sponsor. Miniatures.com is marking a momentous milestone, 50 incredible years of bringing joy, innovation, and unforgettable mini moments into your life. Their high-quality dollhouse kits and accessories are there for every milestone in your mini adventure. Whether you're a seasoned enthusiast or just starting your journey, Miniatures.com can help you create some mini magic today. Not that long ago, I think it was last fall, you did a big project for the National Museum of Miniatures and Toys in Kansas,
Yeah.
and it had a lot of surfaces.
Oh my gosh. Yes, it did.
Particularly marble. And tell us about the project.
Well, that project was probably like the biggest project I've ever worked on. And I mean, it was just like just a huge honor to be, because I still consider myself very new to the miniature community. I've only this year in Chicago was my third time doing the show, my third show ever that I've done. And so the fact that they reached out to me so early on in my miniature career was like mind-boggling. You know what I mean? I was like, "Are you sure you guys want me to do this?" It was just a huge, incredible honor to get that project. But yeah, so like that was a whole new adventure. In total, the piece, the way that everything was designed, it was basically almost 19 feet long of rooms.
19 feet.
Yeah, 19 feet.
And it's a museum, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah. So it's basically an art museum scaled down in miniature. Because, over the years, Barbara Marshall and people that have worked at that museum, they collected, tons of incredible paintings and sculptures in miniature. They had certain different ways of displaying them, but they weren't showcasing the pieces to really give them like the attention that they deserved. And so when I was talking with actually Bill Robertson and another amazing artist, and he was saying that this was actually something that Barbara Marshall had kind of thought up, before she passed away. And this was kind of an idea that she had, but she never really knew like how to go about it. And, she had talked about with him doing it, but it never kind of got brought to fruition. And so now the museum was like, decided to kind of really put, the pedal to the metal with that project. It's an amazing way to display these pieces. So basically it's a full museum of art scaled down so that we have the main central atrium, which would be like the lobby of the museum. And then we have two wings on each side. One was like 15 feet, and the other was or one was about 9 feet, and the other was about 6 feet. And those basically 3 foot long sections of gallery that each one would have its own specific miniature collection. It was an amazing way to display the pieces because it really, like an actual art museum, you kind of start on one end and you kind of just work your way down each gallery, looking at each piece individually. And so that piece was, something that I'd never done before. It was, completely out of the ordinary from my usual type of work.
it's really a genius idea because I can see that, in a lot of the beautiful houses, there are some really great works of art. But as you're looking at it, you're looking at the flowers, the cute little silverware, but putting it in a gallery, the focus is
Yeah.
really on the miniature art, which many of these pieces really deserve that focus and need that
Oh
focus.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's some incredible miniature artists out there that like do some of the most amazing paintings. The way that the museum displayed them before, they were just these cases on the wall that kind of had them all just like, stacked in a row from like top to bottom. So they kind of look like magnets on a fridge. You know what I mean?
Right.
So you're kind of just like looking at a bunch of different things all at once, and you can appreciate them. But the way that this project kind of put them on display, it's very much like an actual art museum. You start at one end and you kind of just work your way down each gallery and looking at each piece individually. And it really brought out the details of some of these artists' work.
Now, your atrium, the entrance, were you inspired by a particular museum?
Actually, for that piece, I kind of pulled in like a lot of like one thing I love is like neoclassical architecture. So when I was younger, me and my mom, we actually took a couple trips to Rome. We went to Pompeii, and I loved the way that some of these old villas were designed. There was these beautiful like homes designed for ancient Roman elite. They all had these big, giant skylights right in the center of the room that brought in all the natural light. I really liked that layout, and I kind of wanted to use a little bit of that in these project. And then, also being in Kansas City, I wanted to bring a little bit of Kansas City itself into this project. And there's a museum in Kansas City called the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. And it's an incredible museum. If anybody's in Kansas City, like please check out that museum. It's amazing. But actually they have two like main halls in the museum. And that museum itself, I think, was built in the 1930s. So it's like right up my alley for the period. And so I used a lot of influence from that. It was just, one of their spaces. It's just this giant room with that's all skylight, and it's just these massive colonnades on both sides. And so I wanted to pull a little bit of that as well. And so, yeah, so I really kind of tried to reference as things that would in particular be a little bit of like a love letter to Kansas City and kind of bring out some of the architectural styles from like things that are personal to me, like having visited Rome and Italy. So it was a little bit of a combination of like all of those things.
Oh, that's really cool. That's really interesting. For me, it reminded me just a little bit of, or at least the feeling it gave me of the atrium at the Victoria and Albert Museum in England.
Oh wow, yeah, I could definitely see that. Yeah, yeah. And I feel like that museum also has like a lot of those like neoclassical influences as well.
Yes, lots of columns, many, many
Yes,
columns.
lots of columns. Yeah. Yeah, and then for that project, even though I was basically in charge of design, tried to make as much of that project a collaboration with everyone that was involved. So, a lot of the staff at the museum, I really wanted to have their input into it. And that's where a lot of like some of the marble work came in. Some of the staff at the museum, they're very into, or they studied like Italian Renaissance architecture, and that's what I wanted to pull into it with like some of the marble flooring. So like on some of the trips that I took to Italy, like I loved the marble floor mosaics that you would see in a lot of the old churches, and that's something that kind of influenced a lot of like the marble designs that I put into the project. And same with like the types of marbles and the colors of marble that I used. I wanted everyone's input to kind of go into it, because this project isn't just for me. This is for everybody to enjoy. You know what I mean? So I want as many people to kind of have a little bit of like what they would love to see in this project as well.
Oh, well, that's what makes you such a good artist and a good person, Chris.
Oh, thank you.
And you did incorporate pretty much every type of marble I've ever seen.
Yes, literally. Oh my gosh. I don't think I've ever done so many different varieties of marble in one project. Up until recently, I'd actually never really done too much with marble because I'm the tile guy. So like tile was kind of like my thing. So like last year for Chicago, I did one piece. It was this Art Deco room. And I was like, I've never done anything with marble before. And I have this museum project coming up that has a lot of marble. And so, like, that Art Deco room was kind of like my first intro into marble. So, literally, like, if you look at that Art Deco room, a lot of the same marble finishes that I did in that room, I actually used in the museum project, because I was like, that was kind of like my first try at like, okay, let's kind of like create this marble effect and see if it works and try out these different colors. And if I like them, like this is what I'm going to do in the museum project. There's a very close connection to like the type of marbles that I used in both those pieces.
Oh, that makes sense. When I looked at the atrium, my first thought was he must have like boards and boards of marble samples.
Yes, I did. And then just on top of that, just like my whole studio was just like splattered in all different kinds of paint. Because I mean, that's really the biggest technique with marble is like, that I learned in this process is just layering those colors to kind of create that depth, because that's the thing with marble. Marble has a lot of depth. And that's one thing that I wanted to kind of bring to the miniature marble, is showing that these, all these different layers kind of make up and just give it that depth that looks like actual stone.
Oh, well, you really did. My jaw dropped when I saw that picture. It's going to be a piece that will be, I think, treasured forever.
Oh, thank you. I hope so. I mean, that was such a crazy thing about that project. It's like, as artists, like, all we want is our work to be immortalized.
Yes.
It's an incredible honor. Like, to this day, I'm just like, really? Like, they chose me? But that was what was great about that project too, is like because they put me in charge of it, they actually gave me the chance to bring in other artists. So like, I had Bill Robertson do some amazing brass lighting fixtures. He also made these amazing little like drinking fountains that you would see in like, a public type space.
Isn't he amazing? I did a podcast with him. He's just has so many great stories, and he just makes the most incredible tiny things,
Oh my
working
gosh.
doorknobs.
Oh, it's insane. Yeah. And like having worked on this project and having to go to Kansas City several times for this, like I got to spend so much time in his studio, which is like one of the coolest studios of any miniature artist that I've ever seen in my entire life. He is a magician, and to see where he makes that magic is even more magic. Like it was insane.
Yes, we spent like a whole 15 minutes talking about everything he had in his workshop. And I'm like, I want to see that.
Oh my gosh. I feel like he probably could have talked even longer than that, because he's got so many amazing tools. Like his tool collection is probably the best I've ever seen in my entire life. It's wild.
Yeah.
But not aside from him, Frank Crescente, I brought him along. Even though I assembled all the parquet flooring in the gallery wings, like Frank Crescente, he made all the material for that. And, he's mostly known for his lighting, but he does amazing flooring also. And so it was really cool to just be able to like incorporate, some of my favorite artists, like people that I've looked up to my whole miniature career. It's like amazing to actually be able to like bring them in. Oh, and Barbara Sabia as well, who does amazing stained glass windows. She did this insanely beautiful piece for the atrium. That's why I love this project so much, because I was able to like bring in some of my favorite artists into it as well.
I've seen her work and it is truly spectacular. You really had some incredible artisans that you were able to work with.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, for this project, I was like, I need to not only the people that I look up to the most, but like I want to source from like who, some of the people that I think are the best. And Barbara Sabia, her stained glass windows are unmatched. There's a couple artists that do stained glass window, and they're all so beautiful. But there's something about Barbara's like this. It's not just the technique, but I feel like she makes them with love. That's the extra ingredient that makes them great.
Now, when you were that 9-year-old boy back in that dentist artist, Chris, did you ever think you'd be here?
No, oh my gosh, never. No. I mean, I always known that I wanted to be in art. I've always been a huge lover of art. So like most of my career, I've always kind of pushed art. I've always pursued art. Like I never saw myself as a 9 to 5 working a corporate type job. That just sounds terrible to me. It just, I feel like I would never be able to go out of the box with something like that. And that's kind of how the mentality and like the goal that I set for myself as a very young age. My parents weren't always super supportive of it because my whole family's from Argentina, and I feel like the prodigal Argentinian son always becomes an architectural engineer. In a way, I feel like I did kind of follow in that path, but just in my own special way. But my mother was a painter, so she always painted. And like I said, my dad was a woodworking. Growing up, I used to build furniture with my brother in the woodworking shop that we have. Like I would build like full size furniture for my room and stuff. Once I got out of high school, I actually started pursuing architecture. Well, I got 2 years into the program, and then I realized that like this isn't exactly something that I want to get into, because I realized that only architects that are like top tier architects get to really express themselves creatively. And I feel like,
Right.
90% of the people that get into architecture, they're working for a firm, they're behind a desk, you know what I mean? They're working under someone else's vision. And that was like, that's not what I want to do. Like, I want to be able to just go crazy with my own designs, my own ideas. And so from that point, I literally made like a complete 180, and I went and I got into fashion design. And so I went to school for fashion design. I got a degree in fashion. And that's kind of what I worked on, for like 10, almost 10 years. I was doing different types of things. Like I worked for different designers. And then at some point, I kind of like veered into doing fashion photography. And so I was doing a lot of photography, working with different designers and shooting like different editorial work. And then from there, I was also painting. So I was doing a lot of like huge portrait type paintings. And I kind of was doing that for a while. I always kind of kept miniature as like my own little hobby. You know what I mean? It was kind of something that I kind of kept to myself. I didn't really tell too many people. I didn't want people like, who is this like grown man that, that's playing with dolls? You know what I mean? And I'm like, that's not what it was. My love for miniatures always stemmed from like my love for architecture and my love for
Mm-hmm.
hands-on work. And I think that's why I always loved miniatures more than anything, because miniatures it's a combination of all the art mediums that I love. It's woodworking, it's painting, it's sculpting. There's history that's involved with it, so it's like knowledge of history. Once I finish my rooms, I love lighting them and photographing them. I mean, like, there's photography that goes into it. And so that's what kind of led me to miniatures at the end of it. It just combines all these amazing art mediums. Just to be able to do this full time, I'm so grateful for it.
And when did you start doing it full time or even part time?
It kind of started right around the time that I was working on the Spanish house. Up to that point, this was always like, like I said, it was like my own little secret hobby that I kind of just kept to myself and just loved doing on my own free time. A couple people were like, they're like, you should just start an Instagram, just like start putting stuff online. Like, I'm sure people would love it. And that's where it kind of started. It all started with the Spanish house. I was posting like the whole process of building it, all the photos of everything that I was working on. And then it just started getting more and more traction and started getting more attention. All of a sudden, the Los Angeles Times, like they reached out to me that they want to do an article about me. And that just kind of projected the whole project even more. And that's where it kind of started clicking. Oh, maybe this is something that I should actually be doing and try to like make money off of. I started with like smaller pieces that I could easily sell and ship, and then veered into, what it kind of became today as like my full-time thing.
Wow, that's quite a story. So I think it's interesting what you said. You kind of kept it your secret. I imagine as a 9-year-old boy, you kept it a secret too, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I wasn't going to school and bragging about, the dollhouse that I just built. You know what I mean? It's like, I was already bullied enough as a kid, so I didn't need to add wood to the flames. Yeah, so that was where like, keeping it to myself and just like as a personal thing. That's where it started.
Well, so how does that work? Like if people came over after school, did you just like have it locked away where people couldn't see it?
Oh, no, not really. I mean, just growing up, because we were from Argentina, we were a Spanish-speaking household. So, like, in general, I didn't really have too many people coming over. I would usually go over other people's houses just because, like, I was always like the weird foreign kid whose house smelled funny. It was just what I
Oh,
was used to, you know what I mean? Like, we always had like weird things cooking in the kitchen. Spanish was being spoken, and so like it was already just like not a very welcoming environment for another 9-year-old who doesn't speak Spanish or like weird foods.
but that's just fascinating to me that you kept it, pretty quiet for not just like, 6 months or a year, like a lot of miniatures do before they start telling people, but years and years,
Yeah, I mean, almost 20 years basically.
almost 20 years. Does it feel funny now to tell people what you do, or are you just used to it now?
A little bit of both. When I tell people what I do, I always get that first weird look, like, wait, what? You know what I
Oh,
mean? Like,
yeah.
especially to people who don't understand our world.
Yeah.
And then the second I'll show photos of what I do, it like instantly changes. Like they're like, oh my gosh, like, oh wow, like, okay, wait, like, what is this again? Like, you made this? There's so many people that like have never had any idea of like what this miniature world is all about. And then like all of a sudden I start showing them my work and like work of other artists, and they're just like, whoa, like this is wild. I've actually like turned other people on into miniatures. They had no idea that this world existed, and now they're like, oh my God, I'm obsessed with this. Like, this is so cool.
Yeah, I've actually had so many positive reactions to photos that that's actually what I start with now. If it comes up, I say, well, let me show you. Because there's no way to explain it that people get it until I show them a picture.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like to a degree, it's the same thing that I had at the young age. You know what I mean? Like when you think doll houses or miniatures, you think like pink plastic Barbie dream house. You know what I mean? Like you don't think of like these incredibly realistic, handcrafted works of art.
Or people think of the Victorian dollhouse their grandmother had.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And there's that realm as well.
I found that it's almost impossible to explain it to people verbally.
I know, yeah. And I think that's why I love like going to the shows and then also guild school, you know what I mean? Because we don't have to explain ourselves. We can just talk about what we love about the hobby and not have to defend it in any way.
There's such an instant connection with someone from the mini world because you have this very specific thing in common that almost no one else in the world has.
Yeah, yeah, and we both understand it.
Right. And then since there are so many different things in mini, it's so interesting to me to be like, oh, you make mini food or you make mini this, and to learn about that particular part because it's every art, every craft, all in miniatures.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think miniatures are like the best example of the saying that art imitates life. That's why miniatures is so exciting because it's not just one thing. It's literally like anything that you can imagine can be made in miniature. There probably is an artist somewhere in the world who's dedicated to just like that specific thing in miniature. And so that's why I think it's so fascinating. And that's why I love the miniature world so much. Even after 30 years of me doing it, I'm always discovering a new thing.
That's such a good way to put it. So, Chris, we brought up glue earlier, so I'm going to ask you, what's your favorite glue?
I swear by the Gorilla Crazy Glue. It's the non-gel one. So it's basically it's like a little bottle with the blue lid. But let me tell you, that is my go-to glue for everything. If you're listening, Gorilla, please sponsor me because I use so much of that glue. I literally go through gallons of it a month because I mean it's amazing. It has a very quick hold. It literally dries in like seconds.
It does.
It's literally like a rock hard hold. So like once that dries, I've had pieces that I've glued together with that, and then like I've dropped them, and they've broken somewhere else, like like another spot of the piece has broken, not where the glue connection was. Do you know what I mean? Because that connection is so it's such a strong bond. I've used glues where you have to sit there for like 10 minutes holding something in place, hoping that it'll hold. And with this, it's like you kind of put it there, and after a second, it's basically there. And so I literally swear by that glue for almost everything. I'll use that in conjunction with like other glues as well. So like sometimes I'll use a lot of wood glue for some of my pieces. And what I'll do is like
Right.
I'll glue the bulk of it with the wood glue, but then I'll put a couple dots of that Gorilla Glue, and that'll give it the initial hold. That'll hold it enough for the other glue to kind of like set and like take a hold as well. That is my go-to glue for sure.
Well, I love that it doesn't take long to dry because that was the hardest thing when I started. I'd start a project and then there was so much time waiting for things to dry, for paint to dry, to glue to dry.
Yes. Oh my gosh,
Like, what do you do in
absolutely.
between?
Despite popular belief, I am not a patient person. Like every time people see my work, they're like, wow, you must have so much patience. And I'm like, I am the most impatient person that I personally have ever met in my entire life. So, yeah. So, if you're a very impatient person and you don't like to sit there and wait for things to dry, that is the best glue to use for sure. Just don't glue yourself to something because you will lose part of your finger. That's happened many times where I've glued myself to things, and once I ripped it off, there was like skin left.
Okay, that's an important safety tip, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
What is the hardest part for you about miniatures?
Oof, that's a good question. I wouldn't say like there's hard parts, but I think there's a lot of challenges. You know what I mean? Especially in the miniature world, and when you're trying to like create things that you wouldn't be able to find normally in the miniature world. I think that's always something that I kind of encounter a lot. It's like, okay, like how do I create this? I mean, if anything, I would say that the hardest things are the tedious things. For example, making 5,000 roof tiles. That is hard, and that's why it's taken me so long to finish that house. In the sense of creating things, like I love a challenge. Like I love, especially at the shows when people are like, "Oh, like I have this bathroom or I have this piece in my house that I've always wanted in miniature. Like, do you think you can recreate it?" And I'm like, yes, I love a challenge. Like, let's, show me what you got. Like, I love that versus like the more tedious things. Like, so I feel like at the end of the day, that is what I find more hard. It's like the repetitive type processes.
I agree. I mean, I love a challenge, I love solving a problem, but once you've solved the problem and making a tile, then it's like, okay, now I just have to do this 10,000 times.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You kind of have to like put yourself in a very meditative state of mind to like not, pick everything up and chuck it across the room.
Yes. So do you have any big projects or plans coming up?
So I just finally signed up for the Good Sam Showcase of Miniatures, which I'm really excited about doing. I've always wanted to do that miniature show. I've always just exclusively done Chicago. And so now this one I'm actually really excited to because it is in California. So that drive is going to be much nicer than driving all the way to Chicago from here. So right now I'm kind of in the process of like figuring out like what I want to bring for that show, what I want to do, if there's anything new that I kind of want to create.
Well, I do have one suggested for your trip to the Good Sam. Take an extra
Yes.
tire.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh. Yes.
Before I hit the record button, Chris was telling me about his experience in driving from Chicago back to LA and how they got stuck in the mud.
I got a flat tire.
And he actually had to sacrifice his show posters to put them as sort of a ramp under the tires to get out, right?
Yeah, yeah. Basically, and like, luckily, I had the idea of mounting these posters on wood to give them some structure integrity. But yeah, we were basically a foot deep in clay-like mud, and we were like looking into the car, and I was like, oh my God, well, I don't know what I'm going to use to like help us get out of this. We were already covered in mud. And then I saw those posters popping out of one of the boxes, and I was like, all right, it looks like we're going to be sacrificing some of my show display pieces. And so, yeah, that's what we ended up doing. But it helped, So, thank you, posters, which we had to sadly abandon somewhere in rural South Dakota.
Somebody's going to be very puzzled about that.
I know they're gonna find these pictures, and it's gonna be a photo of like my giant hand inside like a little French style room, and they're gonna be like, "What is this?"
And it's all covered in mud.
I know they're gonna be like, "Okay, something bad happened here," and but I want to know the story of it.
Well, at least you didn't have to sacrifice any walls of mini tiles or anything.
Oh my gosh, I know. Yeah, that was the scariest thing. You know what I mean? It's like I literally had my entire archive of miniatures for the show like in the back of our car. So it was just like protect the inventory at all costs.
I hadn't thought of the dangers of driving by car, but when I go to shows and buy things and come back, if I do have to fly, I always worry about that, getting jostled in flight. Will they make me check it?
Oh yeah.
The transportation of these things is always stressful.
Oh yeah, especially we were driving on some like bumpy back dirt roads, and so like every time that we'd hit a little pothole and the car would jump more than an inch, I'd be like, freaking out because I'm like, oh my God, like, but luckily, like, no, that kind of shows the integrity of that Gorilla Glue, you know what I mean? Because when we got home, everything was in one piece. It was all worth it at the end.
Oh, that's great. Well, that's good news for people going to the Sam show that you'll be there. That's exciting.
Yes, yes, I'm so excited.
Who knows? Maybe you'll start doing other shows.
Yeah, and that's, really what I want to try to explore more. You know what I mean? I feel like getting into Chicago, that was kind of like wanted to get my feet wet with Chicago. And, it's the biggest, it's probably one of the best shows that there is because it encompasses so many different artists from all over the world. Now that I feel like I've gotten Chicago, like, I figured out like the science of doing the Chicago show. Like, I want to start exploring other shows and getting to meet other miniaturists who aren't and other buyers that aren't exactly able to make it to Chicago all the time. That's kind of really what I want to start doing is trying to explore more of the shows around the country and you just, getting to know more of the miniature community.
That's exciting. Well, Chris, it's been so fun having you on.
Oh, it's been so great.
I just think your work is so unique and it really speaks to me.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
And I just also think, it's just another example of you saw something that wasn't being done and you became a master of it. And to me, that's just a great story about what can happen in the miniature community.
Yeah, absolutely.
And well, thank you again and good luck tiling.
Oh, thank you so much. Oh, I appreciate this so much.
It was great to talk to you. Bye-bye, Chris.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking to Chris. He is so talented and innovative. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider leaving a review wherever you listen to your podcast or a comment on my Instagram. Your reviews help my podcast grow. They also really make my day. Stay tuned on Instagram for news about my next podcast. And in the meantime, remember, there are no rules in your dollhouse except for the ones you create for yourself. Goodbye.